Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Bill of Rights Institute's 10th period close readings. My name is Kirk Higgins, and I'm the Director of Content here at the Bill of Rights Institute. And this week, I am fortunate enough to be joined by my colleague, Josh Schmid.
Kirk, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And Josh and I are going to do something a little bit different with this 10th period, which is unpack a landmark Supreme Court case. This week, we're talking about Mapp versus Ohio from 1961. We're about to release our latest homework help video, which unpacks this case a little bit. But I thought it'd be good for us just to kind of set the table as to what we're doing. At the Bill of Rights Institute, we think it's really important when talking about Supreme Court cases to really put yourself in the situation where you're understanding the question at hand and then looking at both sides of the decision that were written about. So both the court's ruling and also the dissenting opinion. And we do this because we think it's great to do this with students because they're able to really understand that there is an argument at play. There's a question being asked and there's an answer being put forward. That doesn't mean it's the only way that that question can be answered, and it certainly doesn't mean it's the only way that the court will interpret a certain question for all time. But in looking at it this way, it invites dialogue, it invites questioning, it invites curiosity about what that fundamental question is. And in doing that, we begin to see how it is that these different constitutional principles sort of unfold and compete with each other and are all in tension with each other, and that how this great deliberative process that the court does in its day-to-day proceedings really plays out across history. So Josh, I'm excited to talk to you about this case in particular, Mapp versus Ohio.
Yeah. So first off, I think we should establish Kirk and I are not by any means constitutional scholars, but I think we can give a pretty good general overview of the case. So let me start off just by pulling up my PowerPoint here. Okay, so I think that we should start off by looking at the actual text of the Fourth Amendment. So the Fourth Amendment states that the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. So the important thing to keep in mind here is that the Fourth Amendment, as originally created, was only meant to apply to the federal government. It did not apply to the state governments. However, after the Civil War, the 14th Amendment was passed. And the important part of the 14th Amendment for our purposes is what's called the Due Process Clause. So it states that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This began a process called incorporation, where the Supreme Court began to apply the Bill of Rights to the state governments. Initially, it started off with the First Amendment, but over time, multiple amendments were incorporated. So at this point in 1961, during the case, the Fourth Amendment had been incorporated. However, there is more to the story, which we will get into as we get into the actual case.
So just to kind of take a step back, so the Bill of Rights, originally added to the Constitution in 1791, were intended to restrict the actions of the federal government from things like freedom of speech violation, separation of church and state. All the things that we think about when we think about the Bill of Rights were all specifically applied to the federal government. 14th Amendment is passed, including this Privileges and Immunities Clause. And through that clause then, the court has begun ruling on a case-by-case basis that the Bill of Rights actually does apply to the states. And so then the restrictions of the Bill of Rights are also restricting state governments from taking certain actions. Is that about right?
Yep, that's a great summary.
Great. So then in Mapp v. Ohio, which is one of these sort of seminal cases, we're looking at specifically the Fourth Amendment and thinking about warrants. So the idea of warrants being the government in the form of police officers or whomever cannot enter into your private residence without having a reason for doing so that has been approved by a due process, right? And so this didn't take place in the Mapp v. Ohio case, I'm guessing, is where we're heading.
Yeah, so originally, or not originally, a couple of years before Mapp, the Supreme Court had ruled that the Fourth Amendment is incorporated to apply to the states. So in other words, states cannot just enter someone's home without a warrant. What is important to keep in mind, though, is this thing called the exclusionary rule, which basically says that if the government illegally enters your home and illegally seizes evidence, that evidence cannot be used in a court of law. So the federal government had adopted the exclusionary rule at the beginning of the 20th century. So the Supreme Court ruled any illegal evidence seized by the federal government cannot be used in a court of law. However, some state governments, I should say, were still not adopting the exclusionary rule. And Ohio, at this point in 1961, was one of those states. So they said, according to their laws, if the police enter someone's home illegally and they take some evidence during that time which proves someone committed a crime, that evidence can be used in a court of law.
So in the Mapp case then, what was the actual particular circumstances that took place?
Yeah, so Dalry Mapp lived in Cleveland, Ohio, and she was suspected of harboring a fugitive who was wanted for questioning in connection with a recent bombing. So the police came, knocked on her door, and she refused entry to them. The police stuck around and ultimately broke into her house. They found the suspect, and well, it was determined that he had no connection to the bombing. Therefore, Dalry Mapp also had no connection to the bombing. However, the police found obscene pornographic material in Mapp's house. So she was ultimately charged with possessing that material, which at the time Ohio law deemed to be illegal. So she appealed her case to the Ohio Supreme Court and argued that because the police entered my home without a warrant and they took evidence which is deemed illegal evidence, therefore I should not be charged with this crime. The Ohio Supreme Court said, yes, we recognize this was an illegal search and seizure. However, that does not change the fact that you committed the crime. In other words, because we don't follow the exclusionary rule, then this evidence is still admissible. Now, Mapp appealed her case to the Supreme Court, and they took it up. And in a 6-3 decision, they ruled that the exclusionary rule is such an integral part of the Fourth Amendment that it should be applied and incorporated to the states as well. So like we mentioned before, the Fourth Amendment had already been incorporated to the states. However, nowhere in the Fourth Amendment does it explicitly say anything about the exclusionary rule. So it was kind of up in the air at that point still about if illegal evidence can be used in a court of law, should that be incorporated? Now, the interesting thing is that actually in 1949, in an entirely different case of Wolf v. Colorado, the court had actually addressed this exact question. Should we incorporate this exclusionary rule to apply to the states? And in that, they had actually decided, no, we shouldn't. Now, 12 years later, they're actually reversing themselves and saying that, yes, the exclusionary rule applies to states.
Interesting. So the case went through. You said it was 6-3 decision. In the state of Ohio, why it is Mapp v. Ohio, defended. Were they defending the their withholding of the exclusionary rule, or did the case sort of pivot to that being the central focus when it got to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, so that uncovers a whole different layer, actually, because yes, on the one hand, they were defending, look, this is our law. We know best. We don't want to follow the exclusionary rule. But they also were arguing, why are we even bringing the exclusionary rule up? This is about the original crime. This is about whether or not someone can be charged with holding this material, which under our law is illegal. And so the Supreme Court is actually going to, in the majority opinion, I should say, they completely ignore the First Amendment issue of whether the Ohio law violates the First Amendment, and they instead focus on the exclusionary rule aspect. So Justice Tom Clark wrote the majority opinion. We have some quotes from him here that really, I think, showcase his thinking behind his ruling. So the first one talks about how important it is how strong the connection is between the exclusionary rule and the Fourth Amendment. So he argues that since the Fourth Amendment has already been incorporated, it's an essential part of the right to privacy, is what he deems the exclusionary rule. It's so essential that if we're going to uphold the Fourth Amendment on a state level, we also need to uphold the exclusionary rule on the state level. He also argues that this just makes sense to do. So if the federal government has to follow one rule, the state government should follow the other rule. I think he uses an example where he says it's silly that a federal prosecutor in one office has to follow entirely different rules than the state attorney general in the office next door. So he kind of uses this common sense argument for why the exclusionary rule should be adopted. He also talks about how important it is for the federal government and the states to work together to solve crime. So I don't know if he would go so far as to say there should be a complete blurring of lines, but that's kind of the theme that he's going towards. And his final point of emphasis is on the integrity of the government. So if we allow illegally seized evidence to be used in a court of law, he says that that is going to tarnish our court system. Because if a government can't follow its own laws, then that's going to quickly undermine the entire system.
Yeah, and I think that last quote there, the criminal goes free if he must, but it is the law that sets him free, I think is one of the most well-known lines that comes out of this decision. And it's really powerful. The rule of law is something that we think about a lot here at the Bill of Rights Institute. And here I think we're seeing interesting instances of it, both in how it is that law is shaped through judicial opinion and decision, and how it builds in the American context on each other. And there's very rational and reasonable conversations about different applications, which leads to a slow process. But what I see Tom Clark saying here, Justice Tom Clark saying here, is that, it's slow and it's deliberate, but that's what ensures that it is working towards as just a system as we can work towards, which is interesting. And talking about the law enforcement body letting someone go who's breaking the law is a strange concept. And yet that seems to be, at least in this decision, what Justice Clark is putting at the center of our legal system, this idea that we have to follow the laws. Both the people have to follow the laws, but also the government has to follow the laws, which has echoes of the Federalist Papers, where Publius writes, the government first, enable itself to control the governed, and then it must enable to control itself, right? I mean, this sort of reflexive purpose, I think, is really interesting, and I think is another one of the reasons why this case is, sits at the heart of when we think about sort of these seminal landmark Supreme Court cases. Mapp versus Ohio is certainly one that we look back to.
Yeah, definitely. And during this time, that's very much a theme during this era of the court, the Warren Court, is that the government needs to restrain itself when prosecuting criminals. So other major examples are Gideon versus Wainwright, which established that the right to a lawyer is incorporated at the state level, as well as Miranda versus Arizona, where the famous Miranda rights come from. So these three cases, just a general theme is expanding the rights of the accused, using this logic that Justice Clark uses, that the government needs to respect the rule of law if it's going to be prosecuting criminals, because that's such an integral part of our constitutional system.
And even with that, though, this case wasn't unanimously decided. There were dissenters.
Yeah, that's correct. Yep. So there were 3 dissenters, and Justice John Marshall Harlan wrote the dissent. And I think first off, it's important to note that Harlan was not pro-illegal seizure necessarily, but he had a lot of judicial arguments for why he thought that this case should not be decided in this way. So first off, he points to the previously mentioned decision in Wolf versus Colorado, which had occurred 12 years before. And he argues that the court needs to use judicial restraint. If we made a decision 12 years ago that states don't need to follow the exclusionary rule, then we have a responsibility to be consistent with that. Because if the court just flip-flops every decade, it's really going to overturn the legitimacy of the court. And so that's kind of echoing the theme of rule of law as well, because one important part of the law is it consistently applied, right? And so Justice Harlan is saying, if we don't consistently make decisions, that's actually going to undermine the rule of law. He also argues that this is actually truly about the First Amendment. He's going to go back to the origins of the case, which was about possession of obscene material. So he says basically, why are we even talking about the exclusionary rule when this is about that Ohio law? He then goes on to say, though, okay, if you insist that we talk about this, A, it's not going to, promote stability in the court. B, it's also going to start to undermine state authority. So he says that the specifics of trial procedure, which in every mature legal system will vary greatly in detail. So in other words, the Supreme Court does not know all. And he says, let's leave it up to the discretion of the states in order to make their own laws and their own criminal justice system. It's only when there are clear, egregious violations of due process that the Supreme Court needs to step in. And he says, well, look, multiple states are not following the exclusionary rule. They probably have a good reason. Let's just respect that. And finally, he also says, at the heart of a criminal court case is whether or not an individual is guilty or innocent. And whether or not the evidence seized to determine that guilt or innocence is done so legally has no bearing on the actual guilt or innocence of the individual. So he's basically saying the exclusionary rule is unimportant. It doesn't apply to what a true justice system is attempting to achieve.
Interesting. So, like we said at the outset, when we're looking at these Supreme Court cases, you can see two individuals who are looking at the Constitution and interpreting it in radically different ways, which I think is the power of sort of unpacking these Supreme Court cases, because it allows us to look at the various ways that the Constitution has been debated and argued about and thought about, particularly when it comes to this issue of incorporation, thinking about how it is that the federal government applies the restrictions of the Bill of Rights to the states is a significant question, and one that here you can see two jurists taking very different approaches to both understanding that, but also to the way in which either doing so or not doing so supports and advances the rule of law, which is ultimately, if they are working to uphold the Constitution, they are working to uphold the fundamental law in the United States. And so both of them are concerned about doing that thing, and yet they sort of take different avenues to getting there.
Yeah, exactly. I think my understanding is that Justice Harlan emphasizes the federalism system of our government, which separates authority between the federal and the state. And so he argues that in order to uphold the rule of law, we need to allow the states generally to have discretion. On the other hand, Justice Clark seems to emphasize more of the individual rights aspect to the rule of law. So were rights being violated? And if so, what is the recourse for a citizen to address that? And he believes that the Supreme Court has an obligation to address any violations of individual rights that are happening.
Yeah, really interesting. And again, really asking some significant questions, which these Supreme Court cases do. And it shows, I think, the power of the deliberation that happens within the court. Well, Josh, thanks for reviewing this case with me. I've really enjoyed walking through it with you. And I hope everyone will have an opportunity to take a look at our new homework help video that we just released on this case that gives sort of a shorter summary. But I've really enjoyed diving into more of the details with you, Josh. So thanks a lot. And thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Kirk.